and along the way raising concerns about was it necessary to use the bomb. I mean, the film was really more about the invention of the bomb, and then only later the use against Japan, and then warnings for the future. So it was not really supposed to be a muckraking movie purely about Hiroshima. But as MGM began developing it, whether because at the beginning they became conflicted that this would be perhaps would not go down well with the mass audience, and of course MGM was was a studio catering to the masses. It was not looking for necessarily an Academy Award-winning classic for all time. And then they hired as a screenwriter Frank Weed, who was a famous former pilot, had become a screenwriter, and certainly was very pro-military, and was probably not the best person to hire to do a more of a wide-ranging story about some moral concerns. So as my book shows, it goes, because I had access to all the scripts and memos and so forth at the Motion Picture Academy library. I was able to show how the film's message and its depiction of the use of the bomb against Japan was changed and watered down and modified almost from the beginning. And then probably the key decision was that MGM gave the only person they really gave script approval to was General Leslie Groves, who was the director of the Manhattan Project. And people may think of Oppenheimer as the inventor of the bomb, but Groves was the overall director of the project. And so they gave him what was then a massive amount of money, $10,000, and script approval. And so they sent every version of the script to him, and naturally he took out anything that was unfavorable to the military or anything that cast any bad light on the invention or the use of the bomb. He glorified himself. Introduced, if he didn't, they introduced factual errors into the script. And so it became a very imbalanced process where the scientists were supposed to be sort of in charge. Then they looked like they had kind of an equal say, and then it turned out that the Pentagon had much, much more sway. And then as the book goes along, we see how then the White House got involved. And Truman, although he wasn't paid under contract, also had script approval. And so the final script went to the White House, and so one of the most dramatic or important scenes in the book or chapters in the book cover how the White House then had a key scene taken out and revised. They actually rewrote it themselves. Truman himself was involved. And they forced MGM to retake a key scene that painted Truman in a better light, and they even got the actor playing Truman fired, replaced by another fellow. So it's quite a dramatic arc. If you say starts with the real event, the invention and use of the bomb, then you get into the scientists promoting this epic movie, and then you have the military intervention watering it down, and then you have finally the White House intervention, and so it ended up as kind of a botched movie. It was with some good aspects, but also became more propaganda, you might say, about this whole subject right at the key turning point in early 1947, which came just after real doubts about the use of the bomb had surfaced, largely through John Hersey's book Hiroshima, which was a national sensation the previous August and in the autumn. So it came right at the moment where Americans were finally really questioning using the bomb against civilians and the future of nuclear weapons. And so this movie came out, which was partly an attempt to quiet all that.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. My heart goes out to the directors and the producers of the movie because you work hard to create art, but then government officials have final script approval. It would be like if the Marvel movies were edited by the Department of Homeland Security. The final product wouldn't be great. Could you explain what were the legal aspects of film control and censorship in this period in the late 1940s? Did you have to confer with government officials if your film depicted a topic that could cross into national security, or were there more restrictions? Because this almost seems to be going into the area of Russian or Soviet film control, where the message has to comport with the values of the Soviet Union. What did that process look like?
Well, there was no formal process for like a censorship board from the government. Now, you remember there was still the Production Code Office, started with Will Hayes in the 1930s, famously and mainly in response to sex in the movies. And that continued. Joe Breen was then the head of it in the 40s. Very powerful, and this Production Code Office was as strong as it ever was, and it was still mainly concerned with kind of sex and violence and glorifying bad guys and all that. Not so much politics, but it did intervene at times in politics. Not that often though. So in my book, I do periodically quote from Joe Breen's memos to Louis B. Mayer about what had to come out of this movie, but often it's just comical, slang or sexual innuendo and things like that. So he didn't really complain about the political thrust. So it's probably an indication that they were not normally very strongly involved in politics. They were more involved in, women showing women in tight sweaters or cleavage and sexual innuendo and slang and things like that. But there was no real government board. There weren't a lot of flagrant examples of political intervention. But of course, this movie was released. Basically, I basically in the book I also show how this movie overlapped with the beginning of the Hollywood blacklist and the first naming names and the beginning of the witch hunt in Hollywood. So that really started a little just at the time of this movie and just after the time this movie came out. So that's when you really got the political pressure, I suppose, of a different sort. Not so much script approval, but other kinds of pressure.
Sounds more like self-censorship than an overt pressure from the government that dictates you have to have this and this and this and this in your film.
Right. That's mainly true.
Could you give examples of how scenes are changed or characters are changed? You mentioned the character of Harry Truman, but are there other things that you could identify looking at the script revision process of how the film's narrative arc is bent?
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of things. I mean, I had access to, for example, Oppenheimer's papers at the Library of Congress, and there's a great deal of back and forth with him meeting with the producers, and his concerns about his character would be sketched and so on. And there are other characters, the same thing, and certainly Groves was the strongest example of that. So because I had access to various papers of these people, and they did write, because this was kind of a big deal at the time to be depicted in this, what people thought could be another Gone with the Wind or something, So they were, there were a lot of letters back and forth and people worrying about what actors were going to play them. And, Einstein was involved. There's fascinating stuff with Einstein continually being pitched because they wanted to be able to depict him in the movie, and he rejected it, and he rejected it, and he rejected it, and then finally he gets kind of dragged into approving. So it's really an incredibly close-up story on how all these different individuals were kind of pitched on allowing themselves to be depicted, and then how their characters were changed. But there's also, along the way, there's and this may follow what you said about the movie producers wanting to curry favor, not so much being told to put certain things in. There's a whole arc in the book about how the scriptwriters went so far as to suggest that Japan was on the verge of developing atomic weapons and were about to use them against the U.S., which was, of course, completely unhistorical. But that actually was in the script for quite a while. In fact, there's an incredible scene that was taken out really at the last minute, which had showed a German U-boat surfacing off the coast of Japan near Tokyo, and a German commander and a scientist being rowboated to shore, where they meet with the Japanese commander, and the Germans say, "Okay, we've arrived, and we have atomic secrets for you, so that you can finish your bomb and use it against the Americans." And of course the Japanese say, "Great, bonsai," and everything else. But of course the kicker is, guess where this Japanese nuclear lab is located? Hiroshima. So, and that was in the script for quite a while. Even though Leslie Groves at some point complained, he said, "Look, I can't go that far about Japanese on the verge of developing atomic weapons," and so they took out a couple references. But the Hiroshima nuclear lab scene stayed in for quite a while, and it was just taken out near the end.
I mean, for purposes of drama, it hits the story beats just great.
Yes, that's true. That's sort of like an alternate. It's almost like the Plot Against America, the HBO series, the Philip Roth book. You could have a whole series on what if Japan had nuclear weapons and used them against the U.S. So.
Yeah, a lot of alternate history, a lot of interest in stuff like that. I get fielded questions all the time about German nuclear research, Japanese nuclear research. Going back to something you said earlier, Harry Truman's involvement, he actually comes up with the title Beginning or the End. What did he mean by that?
Well, it was, again, this was when he was first being presented with the idea of the movie. And, everyone could be concerned about the future of the world with these weapons in it, and control of these weapons. Can we control them? There's been whole books and movies about the post-war hysteria over the weapons and fears, and then how it developed, the nuclear arms race and fallout shelters in the 50s, and Dr. Strangelove, and so on and so forth. So it was an incredibly scary period. And in fact, my previous book, which is called The Tunnels, which is about escapes under the Berlin Wall, was really set in that period. And much of that book is about the nuclear fears and the Cold War fears and so on and so forth. So it's a subject I know pretty well. But that came a little later. At the very dawn of the age, there was already this, you could say Americans could unite on the question of what the hell are we going to do about this, putting this genie back in the bottle, or if we can't put the genie back in the bottle, what are we going to do about it? And of course, the problem was that the U.S. kind of struck out on its own, and rather than trying to reach some kind of global, they used to call it the one world movement, some kind of global arms control plan, trying to work out something with the Russians. And of course, many people feel we never could have worked out anything with them. But nevertheless, we plunged ahead and then developed the hydrogen bomb. And then of course the Russians developed the hydrogen bomb as well, and we were off to the races there in the 1950s. So there certainly was a hope at the beginning that we could avoid that, and we didn't. And maybe part of the reason is because popular culture and the media and so forth didn't do a good enough job in warning us enough of what going down that path.
What does the finished product look like? Can you give a synopsis of the film that appeared in the theaters?
Yeah, well, I'll try to do it briefly as possible. I mean, it opens, to its credit, it's kind of considered an early example of the docudrama. Docudramas became quite a thing later, and it really is kind of a docudrama because it depicts the real, I'd say semi-real events. So it opens with kind of a fake newsreel where they're burying a time capsule, and it includes a print of this movie for the people 500 years from now who are going to wonder how this nuclear era began, or maybe how the world had already gone through a nuclear Armageddon, and they wanted to know how it all began. So they bury this film in a time capsule, and then it goes on and tells this, the entire story of how the first thoughts about splitting the atom and Roosevelt approving the project, and Groves and Oppenheimer leading the Manhattan Project, and it goes through the development of the bomb and testing of the bomb in the desert, and then but through this they weave in two different romantic subplots.